everybody. My name is Varsha Srivatsan, and I'm presenting on behalf of the HIV Policy Lab team at the O'Neill Institute of National and Global Health Law. The O'Neill Institute and its partners, including Georgetown University, UNAIDS, GNP+, and others with support from PEPFAR, launched the HIV Policy Lab in order to support policy change through partnering with public health leaders, governments, civil society, communities, and financing agencies. Today's discussion centers on the current landscape of harm reduction policies in the context of the HIV epidemic and the value of looking at policies as interventions. The science of HIV is better than ever, but the policy environment still leaves too many people behind. Analyzing the law and policy landscape is essential to advancing the effort to stem and prevent the spread of HIV, improve the lives of people living with HIV, and prevent death from the disease. The HIV Policy Lab is a unique data visualization platform that gathers, summarizes, and visualizes 33 key evidence-based HIV-related policies across 194 countries. We broadly categorize policies into 4 policy buckets: clinical and treatment policies, testing and prevention policies, structural policies, and health system policies. We gather this data through a very intensive policy coding process. We first identify a global guideline and recommendation benchmark, because finally, using legal and policy data from multiple sources, the policy lab benchmarks national laws and policies against global recommendations set out by international organizations such as the WHO, UNAIDS, and other international treaties, fostering data-driven political advocacy. After identifying the appropriate policy documents and secondary sources, including survey data for each country, we determine the adoption status of the policy. That is, whether a country has adopted, partially adopted, or not adopted a policy, and we create an index by calculating the scores. The scoring schema reflects if a country has adopted most, many, some, few, or very few policies that we measure at the policy lab. Why is this, or in general, why is policy data important? Policy data, when available in a suitable format across multiple countries, can help inform governments on where they stand and provide sufficient impetus to shift a government's response. How does the HIV Policy Lab support this? The Policy Lab serves as a reliable source of evidence-based policies and benchmarks. It provides insights and understanding on policy gaps, identifies which policies can drive meaningful change to HIV outcomes, while keeping in mind each country's populations and contexts. Through this, the Policy Lab aims to generate accountability and urgency through robust, reliable policy data that is timely and relevant, which can profoundly influence a country's HIV response and alter the course of the epidemic. Coming to today's discussion, why is policy data on harm reduction important? Globally, 15 million people report injection drug use, and PWIDs are 22 times more likely to have HIV than the general population. In an environment of dwindling financing and growing epidemics among key populations, strong policy data can support governments to make informed decisions and enable domestic actors in holding leaders accountable. Today, we are going to try and understand the value of using policy data and how policy data can be used as an effective intervention. First, using the specific policy on harm reduction, we can see how to use the HIV Policy Lab to understand the overall HIV policy environment in a country. To answer the question, does national law and HIV policy incorporate key harm reduction strategies, including avoidance of criminalizing syringe possession? The Policy Lab measures 2 specific sub-indicators. First, we measure if harm reduction is included in the national policy and service package for people who inject drugs. And if a country has adopted this policy, that would mean that harm reduction services are included in the national policy and service package for people who inject drugs. And a country has not adopted this policy if harm reduction is not included in their policy and service package for people who inject drugs, or PWIDs. For this particular indicator, the data really shows that most countries in the global north, including countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and countries in Western and Central Europe and North America, have provisions for harm reduction for PWIDs in the national policies. However, this policy is acutely lacking in Latin American and Caribbean regions, as well as in some African regions. The second indicator used to measure harm reduction policy at the policy lab is if national law avoids imposing criminal penalties for possessing syringes and associated paraphernalia, with the adoption status determined by whether a country avoids criminalization or criminalizing syringe possession. And for this specific indicator and for over time, we've seen using data from the policy lab at worldwide, this policy has low adoption rates, even in countries in the global north. So overall, to speak for harm reduction policies, only 43% of the countries have adopted both harm reduction policies measured by the HIV policy lab, and about 40% of the countries have adopted one of the two policies that we spoke about just now. Harm reduction policies were most frequently adopted by countries in the global north. Regionally, fewer than a quarter of the countries in Asian and Pacific, Western and Central African, and Eastern and Southern African regions have fully adopted harm reduction policies. And this suggests that despite PWIDs experiencing a sizable burden of HIV in these countries, their governments have a long way to go to align their policies with global normative guidance. The policy lab data has also been used to assess whether countries have enabling environments for specific populations in the context of other related policies affecting them. So while looking at harm reduction policies, the policy lab also looks at sub-indicators that measure if a country's legal environment supports harm reductions for, say, instance, incarcerated populations. People who inject drugs or persons who inject drugs are frequently incarcerated, including about 50% of PWIDs being incarcerated in many countries. Around the world, PWIDs continue to face criminalization, stigma, and discrimination that prevents access to services, and certain specific populations experience this more acutely so, such as PWIDs that are in prisons or who are incarcerated. Needle and syringe exchange programs have been proven to be effective as a prevention strategy, but only 9 countries worldwide offer NSPs, or needle and syringe exchange programs, in prison environments. And only 5 countries globally offer NSPs in prisons and in community settings. When looking at specific populations and policies regarding known intervention strategies, it's also useful to understand if structural policies are in place within a country. Data from the policy lab show that only 5 countries have adopted policies surrounding both harm reduction, something that we looked at first, right, and non-criminalization of drug use, showing that we have a long way to go here. So when I say 5 countries, I really mean 5 countries globally. And so we all have a lot to catch up on. And finally, really, policy data is really useful to draw meaningful associations with epidemiological outcome data. Research from my colleagues using data from the policy lab show that in criminalizing environments, a smaller proportion of people who live with HIV knew their status, and even fewer had suppressed vital state. As opposed to this, countries that have adopted protective laws that advance non-discrimination, human rights institutions, and responses to gender-based violence have done better towards reaching 1990 goals. While the evidence is overwhelming that harm reduction and non-discrimination policies are an effective response, we also want to take a moment to reflect a bit on cost savings. UNAIDS estimates that the average cost of a needle and syringe program is about between $23 to $71 US, and that's only within the US. Several hundred magnitudes lower than the cost of HIV treatment in the US, right? And research from other countries, Australia, China, Bangladesh, suggests similar, if not better, trends in cost savings. To loosely quote Harm Reduction International's message here that budgetary decisions must be made holding human rights, equity, and communities central while investing in health and harm reduction, but also really providing evidence that there are cost savings and measured cost savings here. So finally, what really is the state of harm reduction policies? We find that global harm reduction response is much stronger today than ever before in the past, with over 100 countries, including supportive references to harm reduction in their national policy. While many countries in ECA region, or the Eastern Europe and Central Asian regions, in North America and Western Europe implement needle and syringe programs, These life-saving programs are widely absent in Africa, in the Latin American and Caribbean regions, and Middle Eastern regions. Policies that address structural barriers among PWIDs have lower adoption rates, really undermining a country's overall HIV response. Finally, really to say that using longitudinal policy data is powerful. It's a powerful advocacy tool, powerful research tool, and a programmatic support tool that can help establish causal associations with HIV outcomes. And data from the HIV Policy Lab is versatile in that we can format it in the way that's most useful for our audience and our stakeholders and collaborators, and can be a useful tool in making these very important assessments. This brings me to the end of today's talk. Really want to thank all of you for your time here, and thank you so much for being with me today.